Hello and thank you for joining us. I'm Wilson Stribling. Welcome to another edition of At Issue, where we discuss and debate the issues facing the state of Mississippi and how these issues impact you. At issue tonight, Confederate monuments. These monuments scattered across our state, standing in public places, provide us with reminders of our past. To some, they honor proud Southern heritage and the soldiers who fought and died for the Confederacy. To others, they are symbols of hate, slavery, and oppression, and a shameful reminder of a way of life that kept blacks in bondage. We will hear passionate points of view on both sides of this issue. But first, we'll show you the Confederate monuments in Mississippi and how other states are discussing the issue. MPB's Kendra Wright reports.
There are more than 40 Confederate monuments in the state of Mississippi. That's according to the Southern Poverty Law Center list of Confederate imagery across the country. A few of them are on the national list of historic places. This monument stands overlooking the city of Brandon in front of the Rankin County Courthouse. One of the inscriptions at its base says, "In legend and lay, our heroes in gray shall forever live over again for us." The epitaph of the soldier who falls with his country is written in the hearts of those who love the right and honor the brave. This Southern soldier standing watch is at the Clark County Courthouse in Quitman. This Confederate monument outside the Harrison County Courthouse in Gulfport is the familiar soldier at his post on the lookout. We haven't heard a lot about Confederate monuments in Mississippi. Most, if not all, of the conversation on Confederate symbols here has been focused on the state flag. But in other states, the discussion over the public display of Confederate monuments has produced different reactions.
After Katrina, after Rita, after Ike, after Gustav, after the national recession, after the BP oil spill catastrophe, after the tornado, if presented with an opportunity to build monuments that told our story or curate these particular spaces, would these be the monuments that we want the world to see? Is this really our story? You see, we have not erased history. We're becoming part of the city's history by writing the wrong image these monuments represent and crafting a better, more complete future for all of our children and for future generations. And unlike when these Confederate monuments were erected as symbols of white supremacy, we now have a chance to create not only new symbols, but to do it together as one people.
In New Orleans earlier this year, the mayor ordered the removal of several Confederate statues. Workers taking down the statues wore bulletproof vests, while supporters and protesters clashed in the streets.
We're gonna stand for what we believe in.
Take them down! Take them down! Take them down! Take them down! Take them down!
One Mississippi lawmaker, Republican Representative Carl Oliver of Winona, posted this on his Facebook page in response. He said, quote, "The destruction of these monuments erected in the loving memory of our family and Southern Americans is both heinous and horrific. If the, and I use this term extremely loosely, leadership of Louisiana wishes to, in a Nazi-ish fashion, burn books or destroy historical monuments of our history, they should be lynched. Let it be known I will do all in my power to prevent this from happening in our state." End quote. Those comments set off a firestorm. Oliver was condemned by his peers in the State House. He has since apologized.
It is my belief that without telling the whole story, these monuments constitute a default endorsement of a shameful period in our nation and in our city.
In Richmond, Virginia, the newly elected mayor there appointed a study committee to decide how to tell the story of Confederate monuments in context. The committee recently met for the first time. One member cited the efforts at Ole Miss to improving the environment for diversity and inclusion on campus. At Ole Miss, one recommendation coming from the Chancellor's Advisory Committee is to put the past in context and not leave anything out. Ole Miss Chancellor Jeffrey Vitter says, quote, The University of Mississippi, along with many universities across this country, continues on a journey to acknowledge and address the challenging and complex history around the issues of slavery, injustice, and race. Here on the main campus, we are involved in a profoundly important dialogue to fully understand and articulate our historical truths, while claiming our hard-earned present identity as a national flagship university. According to state law in Mississippi, no statue, monument, memorial, or landmark from any war can be removed from a public property unless it can be relocated to an approved area or if it is a visual traffic hazard. Kendra Wright, MPB News.
MPB's Mark Rigsby talked with Derek Johnson of the NAACP and Democratic Representative Robert Johnson of Natchez about the issue.
What's the NAACP's official position on the display of Confederate monuments?
Well, we've always taken the position that racial hate symbols should not be celebrated, but more importantly, the individuals who fought in the Confederate War took up arms against this government, and we should not as a nation celebrate treasonous acts.
Is it more about treason, or is it more about slavery and race?
Well, I don't think you can decouple the two. The policy that was being fought over was which economic system should prevail in this country, one based on agricultural economy, which used slave labor, other than industrial-based economy. The southern states lost the war. They wanted to preserve the institution of slavery, and as a result of that, no nation in this world celebrate individuals who've taken up arms against the nation. But more importantly, for Mississippi to move forward, we have to move beyond race, and the legacy of hatred is something that should not be celebrated.
Representative Johnson, you made a passionate speech on the floor of the House during the special legislative session back in June when some House members were speaking out against comments made by Republican Representative Carl Oliver over the removal of Confederate statues in Louisiana. He called for leaders there to be lynched. He also apologized for making that statement. What do you think about the public display of Confederate monuments?
Well, I think they should be taken down. I think the fact that we have the Confederate flag, the Confederate battle flag as part of our state flag, is a deterrent for economic development, for evolvement of culture in the state in a way that would be helpful. And so we need to stop holding on to the past, and especially a past that's a negative past for the state of Mississippi.
What did you think about Representative Oliver's comments?
I thought it was abhorrent. It was terrible, and it's another black eye on the state of Mississippi. People around the world and around the country want to believe that the state of Mississippi still lives in the past, that we're backwards, that we have very little understanding, and that goes across. And they don't paint that brush just on white Mississippians who propagate this whole Confederate heritage issue. They do it for everybody who lives here because they don't understand why anybody like African American like myself or Mr. Johnson, why are you there if things are so terrible? The fact of the matter is Mississippi is a wonderful place to live and raise children. It is a wonderful place to start a business. It is a fertile ground for new ideas and things to happen. The problem is having the resources and having the ability to do that is hampered by being able to get outside resources and get people to come in to want to do things in the state of Mississippi because they have this idea of Mississippi being the Mississippi that a person or the statement of a person like Carl Oliver represents. And that is just not what we need to do. We have an uphill battle as it is, and we should not continue to perpetuate those kind of stereotypes on this state.
How do we know for a fact that it's the shadow of the history of this state, the Civil War, the Confederacy, and slavery that is holding back Mississippi?
Well, when you look at the indicators of quality for the state of Mississippi, we consistently rank at the bottom. Much of our public policy is based on race, religion, or region. Race is an overarching factor. So if you're talking about quality education, many individuals won't support it because they think it's black if you're talking about public schools. If you're talking about making sure there's a social safety net, many in this state would vote against it if they thought it helped one race compared to another race. It is a legacy that we must move beyond, and as long as we have Confederate symbols, as long as we have the Confederate emblem in our and our state flag is an indicator that we have not moved beyond the past. One final point. We do not have a single Fortune 500 company or a single Fortune 1000 company headquartered in the state of Mississippi. There's a reason for that. No one want to come here and do business. So if policymakers want to talk about economic development and growth, they need to take a serious look at the images that reflect the state.
In my private life, I'm a lawyer. I practice law. I do a lot of corporate defense law. So I'm all over the country all the time. And I'll get into that experience in just a second. But I talk to business people here in this state, and I'll give you the perfect example of why I know that it affects us. There's a businessman here in the state talking to me, talking about a legal issue, and he was saying he had to go to New York for a board meeting. I talked about this in my speech. And he said, you know, we really do need to do something about that flag. This is a white business person. Had his Mississippi pen on. He said, see this pen I have right here? He said, when I leave the state, I take it off. He said, I can't walk into a boardroom in New York trying to get investors to be involved in my business, and they see this Confederate flag on my lapel, because the first thing, they don't see that it's the state of Mississippi flag. What they see is a Confederate flag. That's an indication to me. Here's a person who lives here, whose ancestors fought in the Civil War as Confederate soldiers, who says that is bad for the state. I can't get business if people think that's who I represent. And so when I go to board meetings or I'm in some court in some jurisdiction outside of the state, if I'm working with lawyers, the first thing they want to know is, how is this guy from Mississippi here? Why is he here? What can he bring to the table? The same thing you do. I'm just as educated, just as experienced, have the same or better skills than you do. But the first thing I have to do is prove that I do, because I'm from the state of Mississippi. Nobody else has to cross that hurdle but me in that room. I don't care if you're from Alabama, Georgia, or Louisiana. If you're from Mississippi, you don't get the benefit of the doubt. So yeah, I know from personal experience that it has an effect. And so it's not a shock to me that we lead the nation in poverty, that we have the lowest economic growth rate in the Southeast. You know, Derek talked about the fact that we don't put enough money in our schools. You know, we have people saying we spend too much money on education, but we spend less per capita per student than any other state in the Southeast. You know, how do you justify that logic in a state that's so far behind? It doesn't make any sense.
The conversation now is kind of moving into the state flag. Now, we're talking about monuments,
yeah.
But how much is the monument issue and the state flag issue connected? And do you think that there should be movement on the state flag issue before there might be any movement on the Confederate monument issue?
The state of Mississippi must grow out of the legacy of racial hatred. It cannot do that if it continues to uphold symbols, whether they are monuments or the emblem embedded in our state flag.
Let's talk about the heritage versus hate debate that you've probably both been very familiar with when you deal with these types of issues. Why is it not okay to pay tribute to fallen soldiers of the Confederacy?
Well, when you talk about fallen soldiers of the Confederacy, the Confederate Army lost the war. It was a treasonous act. They took up arms against this nation. There is no nation on the globe that celebrates those who took up arms against them. So why should we be celebrating soldiers who did that? Secondly, we're really talking about the symbols that oppress people past the Civil War. That when you look at the struggle for civil rights in this state across the southern landscape, the very symbols that people used during the Civil War, they continue to use those symbols to terrorize whole groups of citizens across this state and across the southern landscape. We should not continue to support that. If we want to grow as a state, if we want to prosper as a state, if we want to develop as a state, we must look to the future and not the past.
When we live in a state and these symbols are heralded and propped up, and our state flag has a Confederate flag in it, and you ask yourself, why do these things continue to happen? Why is the funding so disproportionate? Why is there there is no equity in education funding? Why do these things continue to happen? And you go back to our Confederate heritage, that's supposed to be heritage when it really is about race.
Fortunately for the state of Mississippi, too much of our public policy is based on race, region, or religion. And those are devices used to divide people. So even working class poor are being undermined by this same racist policy, but they're being fed that this is good for you because it takes away from another community. In Mississippi, if we continue down this track, all of us will suffer because of it, as we have suffered up to this point. We have an opportunity in the state to do something different. Remove the symbol from the flag, remove the Confederate symbols, but more importantly, let's change our mindset of what public policy should look like. This is no longer agricultural-based economy, global reality. We need to move away from trying to exploit people from cheap labor, and we should support public education in a way in which all children can receive a quality education and the state as a whole can prosper.
Yeah, I mean, one more thing I want to add, Mark. If you get rid of Confederate symbols, Confederate monuments, you get rid of the Confederate flag and our state flag. The other thing it does, when you bring in outside resources, people who want to start new industry, it opens up it opens up the door for people who otherwise wouldn't have an opportunity with the status quo. You know, one of the things I learned when I got in the legislature is that, you know, the chairman of appropriations for decades, for generations, had come from the Delta. Chairman of Public Health, the chairman of Highways had come from Northeast Mississippi. The chairman of appropriations had come from the Delta, and it was the same when the U.S. Congress when Easterling was there. There was this idea that we don't want much change. We don't want to put much money into this or that because it maintained the status quo. When you start bringing people in, then they're looking for new talent. They're looking for more new people to get involved. But as long as you keep the circle closed and keep it small, then you just recycle the same wealth. You don't create any new wealth, new opportunity. And that's what that does. That's why people who perpetuate monuments and Confederate flags like it, because it keeps them where they are and keeps everybody else where they are.
Representative Robert Johnson of Natchez and Derek Johnson, state president of the NAACP here in Mississippi. Thanks for being on that issue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We are joined now by Ron Kennedy. He is an author of several books on the Confederacy, including Punished with Poverty and The South Was Right. He is a past commander of the Louisiana Division of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. He has several degrees from Tulane, Loyola, and Northeast Louisiana. Charles Schmitz is the executive councilman for the South Brigade of the Mississippi Division of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. He was born and raised in New Orleans. He is a graduate of LSU and the LSU Law School. He is an attorney who lives in Poplarville. Well, as you both know, a lot of cities are questioning the public display of Confederate monuments. Most notably, the city of New Orleans removed some Confederate statues there. What do you think about what's happening?
Well, first of all, if the only history I knew, if the only history I understood was the history as written by the invader, as written by the victor, then I would probably be prone to agree with it. But remember, the invaded country, the defeated country, the occupied people also have a history. We have a history that we have a right to tell and for people to understand. If our side is totally understood, there would be no clamor for removal of Confederate monuments. It would only be seen as a way to memorialize and to honor those men and women who were willing to sacrifice everything in the cause of freedom. And that must be emphasized. Our Confederate ancestors were fighting for freedom. They were not fighting for slavery. But the invader must tell the slanderous lie in order to have their justification for invasion, defeat, and occupation of the South.
Charlie, what do you think about the effort to remove Confederate monuments?
Well, you know, history being as it is, these monuments were historic. They're works of art. They are historic representations of their era. And although today modern interpretations may disagree, I think one of the things that's really influenced this removal aspect is that people are ignorant of history, and it's become political. Especially in New Orleans, I think we had a political agenda of the mayor, which got out of control. We need to recognize what our historic roots are, and that we've erected statues and to the memory of many different aspects of America. One of the things I think that's been lost is that when you disagree about history, there's a dialogue. When you remove history, it removes the dialogue. So I think we lose a great opportunity to discuss issues and discuss things.
And remember, by removing or vanquishing Our history is a form of censorship. A free society cannot exist in the face of censorship. We must be allowed to discuss in a civil manner things that we believe in or disagree with. Otherwise, we end up being a tyranny of people who will only allow their opinions to be heard. And that's what happened in New Orleans, and that's what's happening all across the South. The true story about the South is not being allowed to be exposed to the public. Even in our public schools, our children are brainwashed by propaganda from the invader. That side of the history is told. Our side of the history is seldom told.
So you think there's just some misunderstanding about what these monuments represent?
There's major misunderstanding, and it's intentional. That's the important thing. The slander against the South was not done by chance. It was done on purpose. And again, to justify an illegal act of the United States when it invaded the Confederate States, to justify the oppression of the Southern people, to justify the impoverishment of the Southern people. The Southern people were the richest people in America before the war. Since the war, every Southern state is the poorest.
But weren't they so rich in large part because of slave labor?
No, and that's part of the slander that's told. Certainly that was part of it, just like it was part of New England being a rich area because of slavery. Remember, slavery lasted in Massachusetts 72 years longer than it did in Mississippi. Yet you don't see demands of people to have Ben Butler's statue removed. You don't see demands of having Massachusetts' flag removed. And on top of that, Massachusetts and New England engaged in the nefarious slave trade. That's where their industrial strength came from, the capital, to build that industrial northeast section through the slave trade. It wasn't a Confederate flag on the slave ships. It was a U.S. flag.
But what about the people, especially in the black community, who believe that such monuments are symbols of hate and reminders of slavery? Can you see where Confederate monuments could be offensive to certain people?
If the word is could be, certainly. But the reality is, what we addressed in New Orleans was generally not the African American community in New Orleans, but it was the actual young white people in New Orleans who had been propagandized by the media and by perhaps the liberal educational process today. It were not people that were versed in hatred or slavery or, even a more recent civil rights issues. It was people that simply jumped on board a political cause that had been announced.
Remember, the political left sees the Confederacy, the Confederate monument, the Confederate flag as low-hanging fruit. They can go after that because there's been generations of slanderous lies told about the South. And it has been inculcated in the minds of young people, especially young white people, and also African Americans, that the South represents hatred, when the exact opposite is true when you look at it. It is the North that infected the South with the virus of racism. And this was pointed out not by Southern scholars, but by New England intellectual scholars. This is the thing that is so troublesome. These decisions are being made without hearing the totality of the story. It's like holding a trial without allowing the defense to be made.
If I could bring out one major point in New Orleans, we demanded a vote. And we were willing to go with the public vote. Well, the mayor would not allow a public vote. Why would that be? If he has a majority African-American city that is so-called feeling the hatred of the monuments, why wasn't he feeling comfortable about having a public vote about that population?
See, a public vote would have been a wonderful opportunity for us then to bring our side of the story out so that the African American citizens of New Orleans, as well as Louisiana, as well as the Lower South, could understand that Robert E. Lee was opposed to slavery, that good gracious, General Beauregard wanted to put together a black and tan type of revolution post-war where the blacks and the whites of the South would work together to build an economy that would help all of the people.
I'd like to take the opportunity to offer to the African American legislators in Mississippi, if we want to erect some monuments and do some education on their behalf or their causes, that's more than wanted. Mississippi Division stands ready to respect their wishes. But let's all unite together, recognize our history, have a dialogue together, and move forward without a destructive hostility toward one another, much as he's brought out that the media has created.
There's an important point here. In 1890, this was well after the war. You know, the war, for those who don't know, ended in 1865. In 1890, they were having a debate on whether or not to erect that monument at the old Capitol, the Confederate monument, and the white Democrats were opposed to it in the majority, not because on principle, because the state was so poor, they didn't think they could afford it. Representative Harris, a black Republican, was in his sick bed, yet he got out of the sick bed and came to the legislature and made a speech saying, "I too wore the gray in the war, and I went there with my master. And if that war was still going on today, I would be there with them. We must vote for this monument." And he shamed those white Democrats. Every black member of the Mississippi legislature voted with the majority of the white Democrats to fund that monument. That monument doesn't represent division. It represents healing. It represents a people coming together, realizing that we are kith and kin.
Ron Kennedy and Charles Schmitz, thank you both for joining us on At Issue.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
We are out of time. Don't forget, you can check out the program on our website, mpbonline.org/issue. And we invite you to join us again next Friday night here on MPB for another edition of At Issue. Good night.